Hi there, hello, my name's Lines, it's great to see you. Now, today's class is going to be one of our 1-to-1 speed, real-time draw-alongs. We're going to be going through the entire drawing from sketch, line art, flats, shading, highlights, and a couple of bits of post-processing to really polish it off. Now this one's going to come out as a set of 2, with one of them being about an hour long, and the other one being about 2 and a bit hours. The reason I made 2 is that when I made the initial one, it was a bit longer than I expected it to be, so I just wanted to make sure people had the option of something to do if they didn't have the same level of time they're able to invest. Now, if you do decide to draw along with the videos, all my videos, the instruction ones, have homework for you to do. With these videos, the drawing you do as you draw along is the homework. So if you decide to pop into the Discord, I'd love to see it there. I've been going over all of the stuff people have been posting and trying to arrange some time to get in and do some feedback for them. Hopefully I will in the next few days or week, not sure, we'll see how it goes. Now, some of the other things that are currently on the burner are the videos on things like composition, mecha. So a lot of the big tutorials are still underway. We'll see how they go. In between them, I like to do these 1-to-1 speed real-time draw-alongs. So if you have any ideas for things you'd like to see in these videos or in the big tutorial videos about how to do certain things, leave a comment or a question in the comments there. If you like the video, I do have others like this one in a playlist. At time of recording, there's about, I think, 6 or 7 at this point, I'm not sure. But I'll link the playlist there for the other 1-to-1 speed draw-alongs if you'd like to have a bit of a Bob Ross experience with your art. Primarily though, I do make those tutorial style videos for specific topics and you can see them on the channel. Now consider hitting like, subscribe, let the algorithm know that you care, and if you are in a position to help the channel grow, you can become a member over on Patreon, which I really appreciate. Also let you know, I'll be opening up a couple of slots in the live classes I run, so if you are interested in that, you can join the Discord where I post updates on what will be in those classes, how much it'll cost, etc, etc. But without any further ado, let's get cracking. This one's a bit of a longer one, so we should get started. So, getting started then, let's line up where we want to place all the features for our figure. So with this one, I'm just going to arrange things along the vertical third line, just the key points, just to make sure everything's laid out. I have a bit of space there above the figure, so it's not sort of too far towards the edge. So the third line's can be a really great way of sort of starting out your composition. I've got a big video on composition I'm working on, which is probably why it's sort of front of mind. But here I'm going to put everything in the center of the frame, and then I'm going to arrange the other features along the third line. So that will be the face and probably the bust, because that's nice. And that just means then placing those sort of major landmarks of bone, so the skull, the rib cage, and the pelvis, along whatever sort of curve I've decided on for the spine. So I'm just going to give it a bit of a curve out to the left. And one of the things I'm going to do is, I'm not really going to control Z here, unless I forget. What I'm going to primarily do is just do a soft eraser, and then partially erase things when I want to go over them again. The reason for that is it gives me a good chance to see sort of, you know, if it isn't quite hitting the mark, I can see where it did hit the mark. So imagine sort of playing darts where you replace the dartboard every time. You don't sort of get that feedback on your last shot versus your next one. And the same thing's true with drawing. You don't want to erase the entire thing. You want to see where it didn't quite land so you can make your small adjustment from there. So with sketching phase, I won't be doing any Control Z. Now just a little word on the brush, since a few people have asked. It is just a hard-edged round brush with pressure only controlling opacity. If you want to make it yourself, I've got a video on how to make it. I'll link that there. That'll be the little short on it. But it's just essentially the soft airbrush with the hardness turned up. Now you can see I've gone for the ball for the head, and then I've drawn the center line down for the face, and then I've roughed out where I want the jawline to be, like what sort of proportions I want. Anywhere from, you know, Lucky Star to Lucky Luke. And now I've broken up the eye line into thirds. And I'm placing the neck in. Remember, I've got to try and attach the neck towards the back of the head. And now I'm starting with the balls for the shoulders. So these are another part of the bone mass. So one of the things I always sort of struggle with is I always sort of draw the shoulder sort of bone masses in a bit close. And so now I've got a vague idea for where I want the center line of the chest to be, or the rib cage, and I'm going to connect the collarbones in to that center line. Collarbones are a really essential point of construction. They're what you build everything from the neck towards, that sort of nexus there. And when you move the arms up or down, that collarbone is how it rotates. It's as important as the upper arm. It's one of those sort of joints. And so now I'm just sort of adjusting where I want the sort of the shape of the rib cage to be. And trying to remember to get it to be a bit sort of rounder and sort of at the bottom and more pointed towards the top. I go for a bit of an egg shape. So from the front, I draw the female ribs like a sort of egg shape, a sort of slightly squashed egg shape. And then the pelvis I draw as a sort of rectangular prism with rounded edges. So if you imagine when you get an eraser and you've had it for a while and the edges are sort of rounded, like it's still kind of squarish and has those flat planes, but it is still rounded around the edges. And so then I divide the pelvis up. I've got a whole video on how to draw the pelvis, so I'll link you to that one if you want to sort of draw a lot of pelvises. It was a lot of fun drawing pages and pages of pelvises, and you can have that same fun too. So now just tightening up where the neck is, and bring it over into the center line of the body, moving the center line of the body over more towards the viewer. Because I realize I've got quite a lot of tilt in the head there, so I don't need to go too overboard with the chest. And now moving the arms out and just doing them with a basic wireframe. And then sort of planning out where I want to have the bikini hanger. I'm not sure what you call them. I think they're probably just a hanger. That sort of frame thing they put them around. And then deciding where I want to put the eyes. Sort of digging them in a bit. One thing to remember with the eyes is the eyes are dug into the head. The nose sticks out of the head. So it's important when you're placing the eyes, you're not sort of drawing them like they're a decal on the front of a balloon. They'll sort of dig in the eye sockets. Sort of shaping the face there. I'm going to go for a fairly simplistic kind of shape, but just getting that jawline right. Jawlines, if you've seen any of my work, you'll know that's the bit I probably keep coming back to. That's the bit that, for me, if that doesn't click, the whole thing doesn't click, but that's just an internal thing. Yours, mine's fine, yours is fine. I just have a problem with that particular thing, but I'm working on it. I'm working towards. And so you can see here I'm digging the eye in a bit more with these sort of channels. Those third lines can also be a great way of digging those channels in for how to place the eyes indented into the head. And then the eyebrows, since they're from the front directly above, but since the eyebrows stick out and the eye sockets stick in, as soon as the head is tilted at all, they're now going to be misaligned. And so those guidelines up from the eyes can really help get that alignment right. And I'm just getting the cheek to stick out a little more. And that's one of the other things you'll notice is that I'm not zooming in at all yet. So I'm aware that I have a problem getting stuck in the detail. So one thing that can just help prevent me from doing that bad habit is I don't let myself zoom in until I've at least finished the first rough sketch. This will stop me from getting stuck into detail before I've got the base forms worked out. Because if I start detailing bad base forms, that's not something I can fix. Whereas if I get good base forms first, then the details I built on top of them will be strengthened by that sort of strong foundation. And there you can see those little lines I'm doing along the limbs, like along the forearms there. This is something I do that helps me sort of get the shaping right. So I'll split the length of each of the limbs into thirds, and for things like the forearms, the thighs, and the calves, I'll widen them for the first third, and then narrow them for the next 2/3. And now I'm working on the bust. So that one I start typically with a sort of upside down love heart shape, starting from that center point of the collarbones. That one's not to sort of do the outline of them, but rather more to get the flow of that top edge. So you can see here, that upside down love heart shape really helps you get that sort of direction there. And it's one of the other things that's so important about getting those collarbones to meet at the right point, because that's one of the origin points for when you get the breasts and when you draw them out. And so I'm just drawing a bit more of the detail in, just to sort of harden it up. Now the other thing you'll do to help shape the boobs is the way they sort of head up into the shoulders is they essentially, once they're finished with that sort of love heart, that upside down love heart shape, the mass of the breast is actually the mass of the pectoral muscle. They sort of blend into it. So since the pectoral muscle will split from the deltoid, and one easy way to do that is just to get a dot halfway along the collarbone and then draw a diagonal line out. That'll get you that split between the pectoral and the deltoid. And so now I'm just doing some of the base forms on the lower part of the body there. And then sort of planning out where I want the bag to be. I want to have this one be sort of, she's shopping, she's, you know, picking some stuff up that looks kind of cool. And then with the fingers, drawing them in. And just very roughly here, I'm just going to do the sort of grouped fingers, mainly because the grouped fingers are going to be a good way to get those base shapes out. If I start doing the finger detail first, they're a really great example of where it's important to get the base shapes first and then do the detail. So I'm just doing the eyes in here. I want to have them sort of be sort of sneaky cat eye sort of thing, so they'll sort of narrow towards the nose in the center. It'll make them a bit more sort of, I don't know, maybe predatory is the word I'm after. I mean, cats are only really a problem if you're a sort of native bird, so. Now, I've got a lot of the base shapes down, so I'll start working on some of these bits that sort of will require a bit of a closer look. So I'm just going to get the boobs roughly in there, get that rough shape in, and then plan where I want things like, you know, scrunchies, uniforms, that kind of thing. So that's the very, very basic body shape. Now I'm going to give myself another layer, and I'll make the previous layer transparent like you can see there, and then I'll merge it up. And that then means I can work on a sort of partially erased layer. And so now, with a slightly smaller brush, I'll work in a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to do the overall shape for the hair, remembering that because of gravity, hair will always be straighter on top than it is at the bottom, because the hair on the top has all the hair on the bottom pulling it, so it pulls it straight. Whereas the hair on the bottom doesn't have anything pulling on it, so it can express any curl that it has more easily. And as you get further away from the top of the hair has less and less weight on it, so the curl will gradually introduce and express in hair as you go down. So if you have very curly hair, it'll still be straight on top. Now, I'm just going to see about where I want to sort of do for the origin point for the hair and have that come out. So I'm thinking around there, and I'll start my blobs, just simple blobs for the hair out there, and then I'll start feathering and detailing them after the fact. But I'm just going to use that to get my rough shapes in. I'm going to do those two bits of side hair with my my 90s hair intakes habit. I think it's one thing that'll always be with me, the hair intakes, which were a big part of a lot of the anime I saw sort of growing up, like your Macrosses and your Astro Boys and your Technomans, and I guess to a lesser extent your Pokemons. And I didn't really see much Beyblade. Did see Yu-Gi-Oh! That's probably the hair's ridiculous. Actually, no, I probably saw more of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Bridge series than I actually saw Yu-Gi-Oh! Still quoted in my household to this day. Now, those are rough shapes, are looking okay. I'm just going to darken some of the eyes here. The eyes really need that dark eyelash to show up. Like even realistic eyes, you'll notice that the eyelashes, especially the top eyelashes, are a big part of how you define that shape. Because value is how you see things quickly. Detail doesn't show up quickly, but value really does. So that's value. Value is your darkness and lightness. So you'll quite often see that the most important features that you want immediately visually visible, they've got to be darker. There I'm not drawing a mustache, I'm just sort of wrestling with my drawing tablet. Not that she wouldn't look dashing with a mustache, but it's just not quite the look I'm going for. I'm trying to get the rough shape right for the mouth there. I feel like the eyes sort of roughly the right one. I'm going to come back and tune this one in a few times. I'm a bit of a sucker for tuning that in, but I do have to also understand that I've got to have a limit on the tuning in I do of some parts of the body, because otherwise I'll just be there forever. So I also have a long-standing battle with my perfectionist impulses, which are the ones that will grab the wheel while you're drawing and assure you they're trying to sort of help make it better, but they're not. They're just sort of helping you take longer, and the longer you take, the less drawings you finish, and the less drawings you finish, the less you improve. Sort of looking right. I'm going to try and remember to be sort of kind of cross-eyed, like a little bit cross-eyed with when you draw the eyes in. Like if they're both facing the exact same direction, it doesn't quite look right. I think it's because naturally you sort of see eyes converge. Like if you're ever close enough to see someone's eyes, like their pupils, then you're close enough to see them converging on an object that's within a couple of feet, because you naturally would be a couple of feet away. So I think when we see the detail on eyes, we tend to make things a little cross-eyed, because that's how we see eyes when we're up close. That's a guess I have made based on nothing. And so I'm just going to do a bit of hair there to frame the face. I really like hair that sort of frames, it really softens the features a lot. It's one of those things that I personally find quite appealing. So, and then just doing some simple tone of the eyes there just to see if the value is going to work out. I have kind of gotten a bit stuck on the head here before I move on to the rest, but wanted to make sure that's sitting in a good space. And trying to remember not to forget that crease above the eyes, and to add some eyelashes. And then just sharpening up the chin a little bit. Realizing I've got a bit too much of that tilt on the neck there, so I might just move the neck over a smidge. And that'll mean I won't have to have as severe a tilt to get from the back of the head to the front. Because the neck will join the back of the head, not the middle, or the front under the chin. It's sort of, you look at a head from behind, or even feel the back of your own head, you can feel there's almost no space, like distance, between the base of your skull and the start of your neck. Whereas from the front, you go from your chin and you go in an inch or two or three until you actually get to neck. And so here I'm just doing the collar. So I'll do a sort of O shape, a sort of a teardrop shape to outline where I want to sort of see the collarbones and chest. And then I'll kind of build the collar around that. And here I'm going for my first bite of the apple. Tuning eyes. One thing I always do is I tend to make the eye on the further edge of the face, so the eye closer to the edge, I tend to make that like vertically smaller. It's an issue I have to the point where I've got a regular check for it now. It just seems to be a thing I always do. Don't know why I do it. It's wrong, but I do it. So that's part of my process, is correcting it. You probably don't need to do that. I just do because of, you know, maybe I've got a crayon on my brain at a formative point, as opposed to the bits of wire. And just doing a bit more of the collar underneath there. I want to have it sort of fairly open and fairly loose, not like too open, but like, you know, still a bit of chest visible there. And now coming back to the head, one of the things you'll notice is I'll try not to jump around too much, but at the same time, if an area of a drawing is giving you a bit of trouble and you're feeling like you're kind of stuck, one thing I'll do is I'll put a little asterisk on the sketch there and go and work on something else for a while, and then come back to that part of the drawing. And it's a lot like, you know, when you step away from your work and you come back, or you look at an old drawing and seeing it with fresh eyes, you can immediately jumps out at you what needs to be fixed, what the issue is. It's sort of mini version of that. So if at the same time, I'll say, you know, try to work methodically, top to bottom, left to right, whatever it is you're going for, so that you don't miss things, to make sure you're working efficiently. At the same time, if you need to take a break from some part of the drawing, go work on something else, but do leave a marker to remind yourself. So just trying to remember the ear there, and maybe hoop earrings. I'm not sure if I ended up going with the hoop earrings for the design, but I really like hoop earrings, they look great. It's a little black choker. This is not the one from not Martin, I can't remember her name. This is a legally distinct character, so, you know, I think it was Katakawa. If you're listening, this is a legally distinct character, so don't do a Pokemon company on me. You know, we're all good. We're chill. It's just a very generic Gyaru. And so now I'm going to do the buttons here. There's a choice to be made here as to whether I want to sort of put a lot of stress on things like the line of buttons underneath it. This one, I'm not going to go too far with it, but I do like the idea of a nice big sort of cheerful bow. I think they look great. The neckerchief can look kind of nice, but I've always found like a cheerful bow just sort of has a really great energy, so you'll tend to sort of see me use bows wherever I've got the choice. And then having a little bit of it visible around the collar there. Sort of strengthening some of those bits of detail there around the head as I go. And then planning out where to do some, so just planning out where to do some very basic bits of folds from the arm there. But then remembering, of course, it's better to work front to back, just because if I do the arm there, I'll then have to erase it and draw the arm in front over the top of it anyway. So I'm trying to remember, as a matter of efficiency, to try and work sort of front to back. So if I have a surface that is more towards the front of the frame, I should do that one first, so I'm not sort of spending time drawing the stuff behind it, just to end up erasing it later. So here I'm doing the hand that's just leaning sort of forward. This is going to be the one that has the shopping hanging off the crook of the elbow. And so I'm just going to do a hand here, just up in a sort of, hand up kind of pose. The other thing I'll notice is I'll quite often do my simplified hand with a finger, a pinky, and then sort of a merged pair of fingers in the middle. Two reasons for that. Number one, the fingers in the middle are kind of hard to move independently. Like if you want to do a sort of interesting test, there's a thing you can do with like where the nerves are shared. I think you fold one knuckle down on the thing and you can sort of move. That's it, yeah. So your middle finger, fold it down, put your palm, put your hand down on the table, and then you can, with your middle finger, knuckle down, you can move your pinky up and down. Move your pointer finger up and down, but you can't even try to move your ring finger up and down. You move your pinky and pointer finger, but you can't even try to move your ring finger. So they kind of move together, those two middle fingers, and that rhythm of like how they're placed kind of moves with it as well. I think they have to share a nerve or something, like a timeshare. And so I tend to move them around together because they're not really a thing that moves independently very often. And it also throws off that sort of mechanical rhythm you can get if you have all the fingers evenly spaced, evenly moved, which is a bit gross. Like if you just hold your hand out now, you can see your fingers aren't exactly the same distance apart. Quite often the pinky and pointer finger will move out further. So it's just a good way to get a more organic rhythm. But yeah, sorry, I'm getting distracted. So coming back on, I'm doing just some very basic shapes for the sleeves. And you can see I'm adding those little compression points there, like at the bottom of the deltoid and the pinch of the arm there. I do have a video on how to do clothing that talks about this. I'll link to that there. Essentially what it is anywhere we have compression or anywhere we have pull, you'll start to get lines emanating from the points of pressure. There's a few exercises in the clothing video that go over how it works. I'll leave that to you, but I'm doing a very simplified version of it for this. That said, this is one of the probably more involved of these real-time draw-alongs. So now I'm just sort of feathering out the hair. So one of the other things that it's important to do is wherever you can, work from simple to complex. So simplex to complex means I'll do simple blobs for hair. Then I'll come back and do the detail once I've got the blobs right. I'll do the base body forms, and then I'll come back and do the clothing. And so having that layered approach is a great way of scaffolding yourself and turning something from a really complicated set of steps into just one simple thing at a time. And so here I'm sort of tossing up what to do with the waistband there. And I've got to remember the surfaces that the pleated skirt are going to fall on. So they'll hit that crease there, that thigh crease, and then that'll disturb the line they follow. And then sort of as that line is disturbed, there'll be a little crease there where the clothing bunches upwards. And I'm thinking I might have the shirt untucked just to make it look sort of more unruly and more sort of like a, mondage. And thinking about where the buttons would go then. So if I want to have a button down there, I've got to sort of space them out a bit, right? It's probably a bit too dense, but that'll be okay. I'm planning to put one of those jumpers over the top anyway, so I should be alright. And so, the lines there I'm doing for the cleavage, those aren't going to be lines in the actual drawing. They're just there for myself, to remember where the surfaces are. So they won't be big enough divisions to actually end up being line art. I won't use very much line art at all for the cleavage there, because there's not really much sort of upward and inward push. And so now I'm just doing the hand on the other side. Trying to, again, simplify them out, but there's going to be a point of contact I need between the thumb and the pointer finger for where the hanger is being held. So I've got to get their placement right, and the rest of it can just sort of hang. But if they're holding something, what can really help is starting with the points that are contacting the thing that they're holding and working out from there. And so I'm going to do the hanger on the sketch in a different color, just because it's already a fairly complicated area there. So I want to have a way of having it be visually distinct. I've also done it on a new layer so that I can erase it without having to erase the sketch under it. Once I'm finished, I'll merge it all in, but if I'm working on a fairly complicated object over another complicated object, and I might want to erase parts of it and redo it, I'll tend to make a new layer and a different color, just so I can keep them visually distinct, and give myself that room to erase and work up and down without having to worry about all the stuff underneath it. And this one, for instance, I don't often buy this kind of clothing myself. I just don't have the legs for it. So it's not the sort of a hanger type I'm familiar with. And so I'm trying to think of how to look. I looked online to see it, and all of them were all made by bloody ChatGPT, so none of them were very useful, and very few of them made any sense whatsoever, so I'm having to sort of invent the wheel. And as I go, I'm thinking, yeah, but it'll just fall off the bottom, and so I have to reshape it. So it's a bit of a journey of discovery here, so I do apologize that this bit takes a minute. If you know what these hangers look like, I'll let you sort of skip straight to the bit where you flex that particular bit of knowledge. Feel free to skip ahead to the video too, as long as it takes me to figure this out. I don't even know how to put a note on the video, how to skip ahead. Yeah, so there you go. And so now I'm just sort of thinking of where the little sort of the string straps loops would go, because I think they're lovely. I think the reason why they look so nice is they add sort of a non-skin tight decorative bit of flow to a very skin tight thing. So it's like things like ribbons and hairs, they break away from the flow of the body, and so they add interest and emotion to it. So I think that's why string tie stuff looks so nice. It adds that sort of string as a dynamic element that can break away from and add movement to the actual garment itself. Well, I say garment, but yes. Now I'm doing the top part of the hanger there, the sort of neck shape. Again, this is me frantically loading Google image search to try and find a reference of this. I thought it'd be a fairly straightforward one, but everything I drew didn't quite look right. Finally settled on a one, so, you know, from Kmart, so thanks Kmart. It's not just the chrome-plated pineapples you do that are useful, it's also the photos of how to do hangers for swimwear, so... I'm trying to do this and just not having it be too thin. I do want to make it look kind of shiny and metallic, so I think I've got a shape I like for this now. And so I'm just getting the detail in now that I feel like I've finally got a hanger shape that kind of works. Make it a bit longer. That looks nice. That said, I'm sure this hanger doesn't actually have to have that empty space in the middle, but it's sort of, I don't know, visually it felt like the space was a bit sort of cramped for me, but that might just be me. And now just more clearly defining some of these edges and what sort of where, and that little sort of bit of the clothes hanger that tilts back up again. And then rounding off some of the shapes around the sides. And then dipping the middle in a little bit. Again, I do apologize if it takes so long, but journey of discovery. I feel like it's finally working roughly where I want it to be. Yeah, it's okay. That's probably enough information for me to use to do the inking. So now, we look at the image and see what sort of needs working on. what to do next. I'm thinking this would be a good time to work on the sort of jumper that goes around the waist. That sort of tan brown jumper that you'll see on this kind of character. And as always, I'm having trouble remembering which way around things go for the knot. I have terrible trouble drawing knots. They're always a bit sort of confusing with which goes under and over and where and whatever. But I think I've roughly got this one. Or if I haven't, I've gotten away with it. So it just which is the same net effect. And so I've got to remember to add sort of thickness to it, and it'll have those gathering lines as it gets in there where it sort of gets smaller and smaller. And also there's that bit of the sort of the center of it, like the bottom edge to the center, that will come up towards the arms as it sort of wraps around and sort of be folded over by the arm itself. So I'll try and include that, or sort of allude to it at least. Because this bit's actually a relatively complicated part of the image with the different layers of clothing and clothing behavior, but I did want to do a sort of a cowboy shot, one of these, because they tend to just be sort of head and shoulders, these draw-alongs. And then doing a little bit of creasing around the waist there, and just tightening up some of the line of the head. It looked like it was a bit big, so I'm sort of tightening that down a little bit. Straightening it up and flipping canvas a few times. If you don't already have a keyboard shortcut set for flip canvas, Clip Studio doesn't have one by default. I went in and made one in mine. It's in the controls there, so you go to keyboard shortcuts, zoom and view. And I changed it to H on the keyboard, which replaced something I never used. And it's a really good habit to get into, flipping your canvas a lot, because it sort of removes a lot of your visual bias. It gives you sort of fresh eyes on your own work, which can really help you see what's gone squirrely. And so here I'm just sort of tuning some of those facial features to where I want them. Since the face is more sort of front facing, I'm just going to move the nose up and in a little bit. I'm just seeing how I feel about that placement of features there and what I need to do next. It's got a bit of tilt to it, but is also still fairly front facing. Adjusting then where the neck is. I'm just going to move it out a little bit. Yeah, it's working better. Now, if I had to move it a lot, I'd probably have to redraw a fair bit of the shoulders, but this I can probably get away with, I reckon. I just want to sort of lift it up to give it a bit more of a sort of forward lean, because as you lean forward, you'll notice that things like the collar will sit higher, the shoulders will sit higher, etc. So I just want a little bit more of that forward motion to match where I'm going. I'm just going to sort of move some of the features around a smidge. I'm sort of trying to think of where I want that sort of origin point for the hair to be as well. I'm not 100% sure on that. Doing battle again with the jawline. Just because I wasn't quite feeling it. I'm sort of not 1000% sure. And then just neatening up some of these areas here where I've moved some stuff around. Just going to move the waist out to the left a little bit and just make it a little bit bigger. Just sort of make it a bit sort of more of a... it's got a fairly sort of thick chest, so I thought I might make the waist a bit thicker as well and give that curve a little bit more expression as well. And now I'm just going to reposition the arm a smudge. I just want to rotate it in a little bit and move it up and closer just to sort of strengthen that pose, that sort of upward squeezy sort of motion with the arm and wrist up. And now I'm just going to move the bow and sort of cleavage area up a little bit, just so it's more around the neck. And I don't want to have sort of too much cleavage there. That's probably a bit sort of, not that I don't like cleavage, it's fantastic, you know, I've been a fan for years, but just didn't feel like it fit quite the pose there. And it also lets me sort of contrast that to the outfit that's being held, because a lot of the sort of the engagement with this piece is the fact that it's being held but not worn, but it adds a sort of, you know, internal visual process for the viewer. So now I'm just sort of tightening up the feature of the face there. And then just giving a bit more of a clearer definition with where I want to place the features, like the upper eyelash and detailing the eye. And putting in the lower lash there as well. And now matching that up on the other side as well. And trying to remember to get that sort of lower lash to sit at roughly the right height. It's maybe a smidge high at the moment, but it's okay. It's within tolerance. Just giving a bit of a rotate there. And doing some of the line for the mouth and the neck there. Yeah, I feel like that's sort of sitting a bit better. I've got to try and remember to have the teeth come a bit forward. So in this case, if the teeth are coming more forward and the head is tilted a bit to the right, I've got to move that white mass out a little bit there. And the sections of hair there, I want to sort of break them up and have them be more irregular. So I didn't want to have too many pieces that were the same size and the same orientation, because that can make the fringe look a bit more sort of mechanical than I want. And just throwing in a bit of sort of test tone there. The reason I'll keep throwing in this sort of test tone, even though it's not part of the shading, is that some parts will only really express correctly through tone. And so it's important to have a little bit of test tone there to see if that shape is going to work when it has tone on it. And so here I'm just getting rid of some of that because the cleavage won't come all the way up to the collarbones. That's not how that works. But I do need to sort of better define the collarbones and the neck where it joins, and that sort of choker as well, get that curve right. And then adding a bit of thickness to the upper lash there. Rotating the image a bit just to make that curve a bit easier for me to draw. And then a bit more. And flipping canvas, looking around, and just looking it over and doing bits of correction and making sure that I have enough information here for me to ink over the top of it. This doesn't have to be a finished illustration, but it has to be concise enough for me to do the inking, which means I need to be able to use, you know, so I can do an educated guess for some parts, but I don't want to be sort of inking out over empty air. I want to sort of know roughly where things are underneath where I'm going. It's looking largely okay. So straighten that one up. Having a bit more of a look at it. See where I need to sort of straighten anything up. Fix it. Whether I'm good to go on the line art. I'm not so sure. I'm just going to move that eye up a little bit, maybe. And then just sort of rearranging some of the features here. I'm just going to give them a bit of an adjustment, sort of position-wise. I'm just going to grab the other eye and that bit of the hair framing the face and just sort of move it out maybe a tiny bit. Sort of remembering to move the white of the eye as well. Looking fairly good. So here I'm going to go over the inking. Now, one of the things is this sketch doesn't have to be perfect. Doesn't even have to be finished. It just have to have enough information there that when I ink it, I'm not sort of just inking over empty air. And so I'm going to put the sketch, both of them, into a folder, and then lower the opacity of that folder. If it was just one layer of sketch, I would just lower the opacity of the sketch layer, but since it's a couple of them, I'll put them in a folder and lower the opacity of the folder. And so now I'm just going to do a few test lines to make sure I've got the right kind of thickness of line, to make sure it's sort of giving me the right impression. And that's looking pretty good. Now I use a fair bit of smoothing when I ink, just because I don't have very stable hands. That's a known issue. So without it, the natural shake of my hands will sort of show up in the inking I do. So I have to have a fairly high level of smoothing on mine. One of the things you'll notice about smoothing is that if you try and take a corner, it'll smooth out the corner. So if I want sharp points like this, I've got to go and sort of start and stop. And getting those flicks to match up is really important. So if I just try and change direction with smoothing on, it won't work. But at the same time, if I flick without caution, I'll have a lot of bits of crossover of ink, one bit over another, and I don't want that. And remember to do the eyebrows in, because I'm terrible for remembering eyebrows. There's probably at least half a dozen of them on my new grounds that don't have any eyebrows on them, because I drew them in the sketch, and then I just forgot. Because I don't remember things. And then a bit more hair coming in to frame the face. They're making it a bit thicker so it better matches the one on the other side. The hair that's coming down on that side there, and also framing the face on the other side as well. I'm trying to be methodical with this and move sort of top to bottom. Being methodical really saves you a lot of time. Jumping around the image to find the bits you did and didn't do will bloat the time out it takes for you to finish an image. So one of the things about being effective is having a plan and having a method. And so for me, one of the things that really saves me a lot of time and makes me improve a lot more is making sure I get a lot more work done. And so being methodical is one of the big parts that really helps with that when I remember to do it. And at the very least, even if you're not great at using your method yet, it can be good to have the method there so that when you do need to get yourself back on the rails, you know what the rails look like. So here I'm just trying to do softer sort of shapes for the fingers. I model the hands of my drawings from my own hands, and unsurprisingly, I don't have terribly feminine hands. So you'll quite often see when I haven't been very careful, the fingers will be long and square, like my own hands, which is probably not the kind of sort of feminine hands people are looking to see. So that's another area where I have a bit of caution. So by all means, do use your own hands for reference, but if you have kind of, bricky's hands like mine, you may want to adjust the way they express to sort of narrow the limb section, the finger sections, etc. Because that's one of the things you'll also notice is that I tend to only ever draw left hands, because I use my left hand as a reference, which means if I'm drawing a hand, it'll be a left hand. And if I'm not drawing a left hand, I'll flip the canvas and then I'm drawing a left hand. Which I guess is one of the other benefits with that, getting used to flip canvas, adding that to your sort of vocabulary of stuff you do. Alright, now I'm going to do the facial features here and try and get them right. They've really got to sort of work well, so I will take a few goes on these. This is one of the few places where I will do a Control-Z. I mean, inking is better with a Control-Z because you can't really sort of leave it half erased. You can really sort of scaffold for yourself. So that's what the sketch is about, to making sure that you are getting it just right without too many tries. Slight inward curve compared to the left side, but not too pronounced. I'll start from a different side if I get a better result. There we go. Yep, just had to start from the left, that was the issue. And then the teeth, I'll make sure they start further over to the right. And I'll ink in the outlines for the upper eyelash. I'll come back in and thicken them later. For now, I just want to get the outlines in the right spot, so I'm going to thicken them when I do my line art thickening step, which is coming up relatively soon. But for now, I'm just doing the naive line art, and then I'll do a second pass over the top to add thickness and extra bits of black to different parts of the line art. I'm doing a relatively strong line for the underside of the eyelashes there. The stronger you make and more detailed you make the lower eyelash, the more sort of mature and fancy you'll make a character feel. But at the same time, that'll sort of remove your effectiveness of how cute it looks. So if you want to make something look sort of cutesy or kidly or whatever, really thick upper eyelash and little to no lower eyelash, and the more detail you give to the eyelashes, the more sort of mature and fancy they'll look. But with a lower lash, it'll tend to look better with a thinner and less sort of dramatically present lower lash. But at the same time, adding a lot to the lower lash can give a really interesting effect with how it adds sort of maturity and fanciness. It's brought part of the shapes done in. I'm just going to do a couple of little sort of mini lashes coming out the side. That's looking okay. And now I'm going to have a few goes at the jawline. Again, jawlines for me are a bit of an ongoing issue. Don't be like me. Be more decisive. It's a thing I struggle with. A lot of these, I'm looking at them now, chatting over the recording, and they're fine. They were all fine. They were always fine. But just having to do a few goes at it. So yours is probably fine. You can, having finished your jawline on yours, I'm sure you're watching me and getting impatient with me doing it repeatedly over and over again, but all I can say is if you think that's painful to sit around for, wait till we get to the line weighting step, then we'll really have an adventure. Alright, I feel like that's finally got it. Maybe I'll come back later and redo it, who knows. Right, now move on to things like the choker and get that curve right there. That's looking okay. And then the line of the collar. Going to come up and down and around. Remember, we do a bit of overlap there with the two layers of the collar. Collarbones there. The collarbones are, while they're really critical to the construction of the figure and especially the upper body, you don't actually have to describe them with line art if you don't want. You can describe them with just some edges of tone. It's important to describe them, but they're not visually very distinct elements. But at the same time, construction-wise, they're critical. I cannot stress enough how important drawing the collarbones is to having a well-constructed and appealing upper body, since so much is built out from them. Like I was saying before, the neck joins to the nexus in the middle of them. The shoulders are positioned based on the collarbone that connects from the rib cage to the top of the shoulder. And when you move your arm up, they rotate up as well. So they're absolutely critical and essential, but individually they don't show up very much. Well, they don't have to. I quite like them, so I'll tend to draw them in line art, but you don't have to if they're not a visual element that you find very appealing, but they are still a very important construction element. And so remembering here to try and go from front to back, so I'm not redoing the inking, so this is the sort of scrunchy, and trying to be irregular with the shapes and not have like sections that are the same size one after the other after the other. The organic sort of crumpled shape is going to be important, so I want to have like a section that's small, a section that's big, and not repeat any sort of section sizes to get that sort of organic rhythm to how that crumpled sort of shape will work. And so once I've used a piece size or a piece shape, I won't have another piece the same size or shape if I can help it. And then just bring the arm down into the sleeve there. And then the fold of the sleeve as well, up above. There, and around. That's looking pretty good. And so now I'm going to do a little bit of that crease at the top of the boob there, where it's going to be making a point of tension across the shirt, where it goes from the plane of the shoulder to the top of the bust. So those little bits of implied crease there can do a lot of heavy lifting, much like I guess the shirt is doing. Haha. And then a couple of creases around the side there, and just sort of implying them. And then I'm going to do the line of the shirt down the front. Now I want to use more angular shapes here. You'll notice I'm not going for very even curves. The reason for that is that the shirt there between the boobs will not be resting on a rounded object. It'll be being pulled between the two masses of the breast on either side, meaning that it will be a surface based on tension towards the center, even though it's a surface that's wrapped around a round object on the sides. In the middle, it's being pulled between the two of them, and so when you pull on fabric, it'll generate more angular shapes. And so just doing a bit more of the collar there, just trying to remember to work sort of top to bottom, front to back. Be as regular as I can. I'm terrible for getting distracted by one bit or another. So, like with everything else, you know, don't do what I do better. Please. And doing a bit more of the bag there, and that little bit on the inside of the bag there. I know normally I'd skip that bit of detail, but I had to fix one of these bags while I was at the shop the other day. And they're sort of attached on the inside with the world's cheapest glue. But I always carry a little thing of super glue with me, so I'm good there. They all thought I was crazy. They all thought I was mad. The day has finally come. So I got to use the super glue. Still not nearly as good as the day I got to use the telescope I carried in my jacket for like a month and a half. Hanging that thing in there for ages, thinking if I can just pull a telescope out of my jacket with no warning, that will wow everyone. And it will be, I was at high school at the time. And so we're in the middle of a footy field, and they're like, is that Davo? And out of nowhere, I pull a telescope out of my coat and go, yeah, that's him, and put it back in. Didn't make a point of it, didn't make a big deal of it. But everyone was, what the? It was a real Inspector Gadget kind of moment. It was great. So I had been carrying that thing for like a month, probably more. Right, now I'm trying to do the tied up sort of jumper in the front there. And sort of, I had to sort of pull up a picture of like a jumper tied in a knot around someone's waist, and I got like halfway through before I realized that Google Images had given me a bloody AI-generated reference, which the knot didn't make any sense, which didn't help at all, so I had to find another. Oh, it's a frustrating experience. Not as bad as trying to sort of... I had a student trying to do horse anatomy, and the problem is you can't find horse anatomy pictures with image search anymore because it's all slop. So I had to sort of dig out one of my old textbooks and take a photo of that, which was kind of cool. It's an Animal Anatomy, I think 4th edition. It's the one with the black cover and the horse skeleton on the front. It's a fantastic book. I've got it referenced actually in my furries video. It's fantastic. So here I'm just doing a bit more creasing around the waist, and one of the things you'll notice is where the jumper is tied tight, it'll make crumples and wrinkles itself, but also it's going to make crumples and wrinkles in the shirt above it where it pulls down. So if you imagine you have like a loose sleeve and you tie a belt around that really tightly, there's going to be those natural really tight crumples next to the belt. And so anytime you have anything that's tight around a surface, it'll make crumples and creases on any loose surfaces next to it. And so here I'm just doing a bit of the alluding to the creases and pleats in the skirt. And now I'm just moving up around the image there, realizing I've sort of followed the flow of the image top to bottom, but I've missed out on the sort of the detail of the arms there. So I'm just popping back up to put that detail in. And trying to remember to put a bit of sort of creasing there. I won't necessarily do the creases in the shirt using Lineart. The creases in the shirt are lined out there in the sketch, but that's more as a sort of mental thing for me to remember the directions, or at least sort of think of the directions I want them to go in. And most of them I'm actually going to express using some areas of shading. And you'll also notice that I'm drawing underneath where the bikini hanger will be. If you have a complicated object over the top of another complicated object, one of the things that can really help is essentially doing them separately on a separate layer and then just erasing out underneath. Otherwise, you'll do the one on top and you have to sort of, carefully start and stop the lines behind it. And that's just going to lead you to some bad sort of flow. Whereas if you just do them simply, it'll end up being quicker overall, since you'll be able to do the lines much more comfortably without stopping and starting, and then you just erase the parts that they overlap on. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to do the line art for the hand separately to the line art for the clothes hanger. And I'm just doing the thumb. I'm going to move the thumb down a bit because I realized the thumb was kind of behind where the hanger was, so that didn't quite work. So I'm just doing the finger there and the sort of fold for the thumb there where it's sort of bent back. And then the hand where it's tilted back towards the wrist. I'm sort of marking out where I think the point in the wrist will be. And also trying to remember that the shape of the hand is based really a lot around the bulge of the pads of the palm. If you can see in the hands video that I've got, which hopefully I'll have linked, one of the things about it is that the hands are essentially like a flat kind of, like a whiskey flask shape with these big lumpy pads on them that really define their shape. So you've got the pad next to the thumb, the pad line under the fingers, and the pad on the outer edge that actually comes out past the side edge of the hand. And so it's those sort of pads that really shape the hand. So I'm trying to keep them in mind. I'm just doing a bit more of the outline here, and outline a bit of the hair there as well. 42, 43, 44, 45. And then just some simple bits of hair there. Nothing too detailed. I'm not going to do any shading or anything on them, but I've got to remember that their hair is coming down a fair bit around behind the character, and so that's going to sort of fill out the silhouette. So I've got to have at least that set up there to catch the silhouette. So I'm looking at the figure overall, and you guessed it. Gonna have another bite at the apple. Again, I need to work on this. It's a known issue. It's an area of improvement. We're working towards. It's not an area of strength. I think one of the reasons it always looks okay in the sketch, and it doesn't quite sort of mesh in the final line art, is that with a sketch, your sketch will often look better because your brain's kind of filling in the blanks on the blurry, ill-defined lines. Whereas once you actually have line art on the page, it really sort of nails down what's actually there. And so line art is literally perfectly unforgiving, whereas sketch can be very forgiving. And so I'll often find that with, like when you're thinking of an idea in your head, like this would be a cool scene, and then when you think of like how I would actually approach it, and those finer, subtle points of how you deliver that idea can completely change the way it is read or interpreted or viewed. And those things don't happen when it's a concept. When it's a concept, imagination is always in high def. And the same sort of thing is partially true for sketches, I think, because so much of your imagination is coming in to fix the shapes. And so the sketch will always look right, even if the ink looks wrong, because the sketch doesn't look right. The sketch is being corrected by your brain, but it's not the same thing as it looking right. That's what it was. Marin Kitagawa. That's the name of the person. There's another one. There's another show. It was like a comedy, like a sketch show, like a 10-minute long one. Like it was Oshiete Garuko Sama San Nantoka. It was really funny. I quite liked it. I should probably follow up on it, but it was funny. Maybe a bit horny, but, you know, still funny. That said, that dress-up talent show was very funny and incredibly horny. Well, I mean, it's a teenage romance show, so obviously it's essentially like confusion and horniness combined. That's basically all of my teenage romances. Confusion, fear, horniness, and I don't know, access to inexpensive beer. Who knows? And just going through there and getting some of the detail in for the front of the strap there. And I'm trying to do the straps first before I do the outline of the bikini hanger. And I mean, you can also see that the bikini hanger is on its own layer here. So I'm not drawing over the top of my line art, I'm drawing on a separate layer. And I've also done it in a separate color that I can just make that darker layer. I can just do, you know, Control U to load up the brightness and contrast, lower the brightness all the way down, it'll turn it black. So I'm just doing it in a different color here, so I can make it out from the rest of the image when it comes time to delete it later. And once I have deleted the bits that conflict, I'll then just merge it in. It'll be one unified layer. So I'm doing those sort of bikini string bits that come over the top. I could also have done the outline of the hanger and then just erased sections of it to get the hanger's flow to work better. Like you can even see there on the hanger on the outer edge where the bikini string comes in on the right hand side. Since I've started and stopped that line for the hanger, it doesn't have as good of a flow where it starts and stops on one side and then the other side of the bikini string. It's not a very big visual detail, but if it was a really critical detail, it would have been better in that case to just draw it and then erase the section out that I want the overlap of the bikini string. But in this case, it's not a very important visual feature, so I'm just going to do this. But again, that's one of those choices to make. And so looking over there to make sure I haven't sort of missed any bits, but I have missed the bit where it sort of ties behind the neck. That sort of bit that in the OVA gets amusingly pulled on by, I don't know, some sort of animal mascot. I guess the animal mascots in anime are far worse behaved than the ones in Disney. Disney ones never do that. That's looking okay. I'm just lowering the visibility of the sketch there. One of the things you'll notice is with a sketch, if the sketch is kind of dark, it'll make it look like some parts are finished when they're not. So it'll add a lot of sort of visual clutter. So now I'm going over the ink layer and deleting anything that shouldn't show through the bikini hanger in front. And so I can't erase any of the green because I'm currently erasing the black line art layer. This is why I've got on separate layers, so I can erase one without having to touch the other at all. And you can see it comes out a lot sort of cleaner than sort of trying to erase it and leave bits. Just keeping them separate layers means that I can go right up to the edge there, and that'll make it cleaner, not less clean. So it just sort of makes a bit of sort of easier workflow for myself. Now with this, I will tend to sort of miss a bit here and there, probably inside of a knot or some line that goes through whatever, but as long as it's broadly correct, I'm sure it'll be fine. If you are worried about it being sort of broadly correct though, one thing you can do, if it's a lot more complicated than this, you could actually do an early bit of bucket filling your flats with it as an independent object, and that will sort of block out the ink underneath it. So that's another option if it's very complicated. This one's not too complicated, it's like an outside line and some inner lines, but if yours was more complicated, you may want to just sort of fill in the flats on that sort of green line art layer or whatever it is you got in front, and that would then cover over any line art there. And so now I'm just flicking the ink on and off to see what details I've missed, and sure enough, I missed a bit of detail on the side there of the bikini hanger. We'll look to see if there's any other bits of detail that I need to make sure I've got in before I move on to the next layer of, the next sort of step of production. Overall, it's looking good. So I've merged the two ink layers in together, and then I darkened everything. So Control U, that'll load up the hue, lightness, and saturation, and just set it all the way black. And now I'm going to color that first layer of Lineart red using the layer color, and then make a layer on top of it. And this layer is going to be called the ink thickener. So the reason why this is separate is that I want to add line thickness. Now you can add line thickness with your initial bit of line art if you want. That's absolutely fine. A lot of people do, and it looks great. Like Rumiko Takahashi, the lady who wrote Ranma and Yurusei Yatsuro and a couple other things. She does a lot of her early manga with a brush pen, which is just cool. And that means she's planning the depth and thickness of shadows on her characters and doing it in the first pass. And for a manga author, that's a great way to do it. If you can do that, that'll save you a ton of time. And speaking of ton of time, this is the bit where I go in and add a bit of thickness to any sort of surfaces that are coming close to each other. So what this is an ambient occlusion pass. If you've heard me talk about this a few times, then go grab a cuppa. I'm about to do it again. But what it is, anytime you get sort of objects that come close to each other, it makes it hard for the ambient light in the room or situation to get in and fill those dark areas in. If you make your hand into a fist in front of you and you look at the little creases in your pointer finger as it wraps around, you'll notice they get darker and darker, and no matter where you shine light on that, those bits are going to be really dark. The reason for that is anytime you have surfaces sort of cinching in like that, you really narrow the angles at which light can possibly get in, including ambient light, which comes from all directions at all times. So that's one of the things I like to do with this. I use this as my ambient occlusion pass. If I was doing like a really soft lighting, I'd do a lot more ambient occlusion on the piece itself, but with this, since the piece is going to be direct lighting, I'm just doing this as a way of thickening some of the line art and also giving a bit of shape to it by describing some bits of ambient occlusion. And you see here I'm adding that little extra bit of black to the eyelashes there. Just since it's, me adding black to the line art, there's no sense doing it at another time because this is, I can double up the job here. That's not ambient occlusion, that is darker. It's a big thick bit of dark sort of value there. It's an important thing to have in your image too. One of the really good things about having big dark eyelashes is it really draws attention because value is the thing that snaps the eye to an image. And here I'm adding a bit more sort of thickness to the line of the jaw there. One of the other things that line art will do, and I talked about this when I was mentioning before that things like you'll see the fabric folds in the sketch that aren't present in the final line art is because I don't want line art for that. Line art really shows separate objects, and the thicker the line art, the thicker the separation of those objects. And so with things like clothing folds, I don't want them to have any kind of separation. That's all the same object. It's just different planes of light and shadow. So in that case, I would have those lines, quote unquote, just be edges of tone. Whereas things where I want a really strong separation, like the jawline from the chin, where I want to really sort of show that distance of the chin from the neck behind it, if I thicken that bit of line art there, that really separates those objects and makes them stand out from each other visually, and it gives it a bit more depth. Thinking about it, it's also how I do my poster or sort of sticker design line art. You can see this in the chibi version of this, because this is part of the twinned one. Just because this is a fairly long one relative to the other sort of 1-to-1 speed draw-alongs. So I thought I'd make a sort of quicker one that was an easier one to do if you're not the sort of, flushed with time. It's just a sort of just under 1 hour one, or around about 1 hour, give or take. And that one is a lot more of a sort of flat, chibi graphic design kind of thing. And so because of that, it's more of a sort of sticker design than a realistic thing. And so I used a very thick line of line art around the outer edge of the figure to really separate them from the simple background, which you wouldn't necessarily do with like a something like this has a little bit of realism to it. Like, it's not terribly realistic, but it's still, semi. And that sort of separation of objects can be used to separate the object of the character from the object of the background. And so here I'm just doing a bit of those same little bits of darkness around there. There's a bit of ambient occlusion. Again, fairly time consuming, and the more complicated the piece, the more time consuming it is. It is also completely optional. You can also do it as part of when you do your inking, if you have good control over your brush, and if you have good planning. I probably could. I like doing these videos with all of the elements as split up and as scaffolded as I can, so that it's sort of easier to understand. That comes back to the idea of don't do complicated things. Never do complicated things. If you have a complicated thing you have to do, make that complicated thing into several really simple things. And so if you have trouble doing a complicated control over your line art as you draw, don't do that. Don't do the thing you have trouble with. Do a simple thing. Do naive line art and then add your thickness where you feel like it's needed. And so this is a demonstration of that, of not trying to do a complicated thing, but rather having a complicated result by doing a lot of simple things together. Just going a bit more here. I keep missing the sort of hands here as I sort of flow down the image, and just sort of adding those little dark bits there. So anywhere where an object is sort of creasing in or sort of coming over the top of another object, just to sort of separate it out a little bit. And how much you do this is really up to you. You can do these quite thick and look kind of cool. You can do them quite thin, also fine, or you can do them for an entirely different goal. You could even do things like, this is something I've seen in, I think it's John Gerard Mobius. He's a French artist, absolutely amazing artist. I'm sure you've heard of him. He does a lot of amazing stuff with line as contour, as well as with line as sort of expression of direct light, which is really cool. And so he'll have thicker line art to sort of simulate dark shadows from cast light, which is wonderful. I've had a couple of goes at it myself. It doesn't necessarily give me the same result, which is to be expected. It's the same result as as a French master painter. But yeah, amazing artist. Got introduced to him by an absolutely rubbish uni lecturer, so I still got a lot out of that lecture, so thank you, you shiny-headed so-and-so. And just a bit more on the creases here. And there, a bit more of that sort of the folds there, because there'll be a lot of these sort of deep folds in, these deep sort of areas of occlusion, especially sort of on the underside. You can make these more pronounced as you move into darker areas too, which can work really well, because ambient occlusion is more strongly expressed in areas that are darker overall. But for the most part, this is also a great chance. You can see there, just on the right-hand side at the bottom of the skirt there, this is also the pass where I go over and draw in any bits of line art that I just straight up forgot to do. And so it's a good way of giving yourself a bit of sort of correction. So you're looking relatively carefully over the whole image. One thing you can also do is flick, like this, your ink layer on and off. And if you've forgotten to do a whole section, like I did, you'll notice there'll be a gap in where all these little black sort of flecks are. So it's another one of the benefits of doing this on a separate layer, just as a sort of workflow and productivity thing. It means you can do a quick error correction or error check where you turn off your ink layer, and that'll show you any gaps you've got in where you've forgotten to do some of these. I'm doing a bit more line there for where the hair intake's going to go. It's looking largely okay. That's looking alright. I'm going to turn that overlay off there as well. Sort of thinking about some of these shapes. I don't want to tune some of them in, like the finer shapes on the nose there. And just see if we've got any sort of excess bits hanging over the top anywhere. Maybe want to sort of fix in just a little bit more dark around the mouth there. Just to really sort of communicate those little edges there. Some areas are going to get a ton of focus, some areas are going to get almost none. One of the reasons for that is you've got to sort of prioritize where you want to put the effort in. Like, you can't put detail everywhere, because if you put detail everywhere, the whole thing gets sort of lost. It's the sort of Where's Wally's principle. If everything's detailed, nothing is. Whereas if you only have certain bits detailed and focused, then those bits are going to get attention. But if everything is attention-getting, nothing is. It's like a Michael Bay movie. Every scene is shot like it's important. Every scene is shot in slow motion. Every scene is pivotal and crucial. And by the end of the first 20 minutes, you're numb and you forgot about the fact that what Bumblebee did to a guy in one of the movies. Someone reminded me of, like, hey, remember that thing where Bumblebee did that on a dude? And like, what? That did not happen. I'm like, no, it happened. And so the fact that every part of that movie was shot to be like, oh, this is a special moment, basically makes it numb to the viewer. And so the same thing will happen with your drawings. If you try and do too much everything in focus, then nothing will be. So by all means, tune and get some parts right, but don't do that everywhere. Do it on the parts that really matter, and let the detail even fall off as you move away from it, because as the detail falls off, the focus of the viewer will fall off, and that'll actually help direct them towards the focal points. So now I've got my inks done, I'm going to move on then to doing the flats. So I've got a layer for the flats, and I'm just sort of thinking about what sort of colors I want to do for this one. I'm thinking for the skin, I'm going to go with a sort of darker skin tone, which is actually a fairly light kind of orange tone. So one of the things you sort of notice is that skin tone is actually more sort of yellows and oranges, with especially like dark skin is orange. If you ever go sort of into Photoshop or one of the photo editing ones, you don't use Photoshop, it's Adobe. You'll notice that when you lower just the orange tones, anyone with sort of dark skin will go monochrome, and pale sort of skin is reds, and so they'll stay. And so there is a difference in skin color. It's just like orange to pink. It's not a sort of tone thing. And so here I'm going to do the edges there, so that when I fill in with skin tone and actually set the bucket to refer to other layers, that it will leave some white for the sclera. And so I'll just drop in anywhere where there'd be sort of visible skin, which there isn't actually very much on this character. It's just mainly the sort of hands and neck and head. Like, I'm sure if we sort of move down a bit, there'd maybe be a bit of like leg visible, but for now it's just sort of those sections there. So there's not actually very much skin tone visible in this one, which is fine. And now I'm just going to tune that color, maybe to give it a bit more redness. So this is just going Control U on the keyboard to load up the hue and saturation. I'm doing this with the skin tone first, because once the skin tone is set, that's the sort of color I want to match everything else off of, and sort of build off of to make sure it sort of fits with. And so I'm just sort of trying to get that one right first. The other thing is, it can be kind of hard to get the skin tone to look right when you've just got a pure white canvas, because everything on white looks darker than it actually is. So if you do a very, very pale grey, like an almost white grey on top of white, it will look grey. But that same almost white grey over the top of pure black will look pure white. So it's that relativistic nature of tone that you've got to sort of manage there. And so here I'm just trying to find one, and I'm closing one eye and sort of pinching my fingers around. So I've got a little sort of, you know, like the binoculars you make when you're a kid, like just out of your hands. I do one of them, and to sort of isolate in to see just a part of the skin tone, to see how that looks in isolation. And so now I'm doing a sort of pale hair color, maybe just like a straw color, like an almost white sort of yellow. And I'm going to do a sort of dual tone with a bit of pink towards the ends. Again, this is legally distinct from, I just said it, what's her name? Marin, from that other show. This is a legally distinct character. This is a very, very different person, not the same person, 100% different. And so here I'm going over the white shirt, but I'm actually going to do the white shirt in an almost white blue. The reason for this is twofold. Number one, white, you never want to go sort of all the way white. You want to give yourself room to add highlights to it. So if you think of like someone with really, really white teeth, if you had a photo of that, you'd be able to see white teeth, but also the teeth would have highlights on them, which means the areas that aren't highlighted would not be pure white. They have to be something else. They'll usually be like a sort of yellowy tan grey, but a really, really pale one. And so here I'm just adding in the areas of white for the shirt. They can be kind of hard to see. If they are hard to see, one thing you can do is you can turn off the paper layer, and that'll show you where I've got any gaps. I'll do that later once I've got these in. You can see sort of which bits I've missed, because I visually can't tell the difference between that sort of pale blue and actual white. So now I'm just doing the blue for the nails. I want sort of colourful fingernail colours as part of that sort of type of character. I'm just going to do a bit of use the pen tool to do some edges around there, so that when I do the bucket fill, it'll just fill up to those lines, even if those lines aren't sort of part of the line art. And now I'm sort of picking a sort of darker, sort of bluey green for the eyes. And now I'm going for a sort of a warm grey, like a really dark, warm grey for things like the choker, and I'll reuse the colour as well on the skirt. You've probably heard me say this as well a few times, so I do apologise again. One of the things that can be really handy is reusing colours within your image. So for instance, the bikini colour there is just a different saturation and lightness level of the colour from the scrunchie. One of the reasons this is good is that it makes the image overall more cohesive if you have a lot of reused colours. And it also means that the colours that work together will work together everywhere else. So you don't have to worry about sort of making sure that a more and more involved colour scheme will have, that will be cohesive. If you're reusing essentially the same 4 colours in different lightnesses and saturations, if those 4 colours work together, then overall your image will work together. And so here I'm just adding the actual pure white for things like the sclera. And I'm just getting the pen tool in there because the bucket fill will make these sort of ugly edges. You can get around that by doing a control click on your flats layer, inverting that selection, and what that will mean is you're now only able to fill in colours, and you won't be able to go over the top of any other colours you've already done, which can save you a couple of steps. It's up to you if that's sort of worth the time. Alright, I'm just going to get a slightly different sort of reddish colour then for the bow. Like, I want kind of a cool red, so I've just tilted it a little bit towards purple, and I haven't gone full saturation. Like, you never go full saturation. I think it was a quote from Robert Downey Jr. And I'm just going to get that sort of one bit of fairly strong red in the middle there. There's a couple of strong bits of colour here, so I'm trying not to go too hard on it. But at the same time, like this kind of, the Gyaru thing is all about this overwhelming colour, overwhelming, you know, it's not reserved at all. It's very much like an anti-reserved fashion statement. It is the literal opposite of a kimono. It's not this this reserved, you know, minimalist design. It's maximalist, which is its own kind of cool, I gotta say. So I'm just realizing that I've done a control click there instead of just switching to my brush. There we go. And that's all right, that's looking okay. And so there you can see I'm reusing the choker color for the dark color of the skirt. And then there's a bit of the skin color there showing just on the side there, so I told you to be a bit. And then just filling in some of the colors here. This is a sort of a complicated part over another kind of complicated part, but that's okay. And now just grabbing some of that green from the eyes, making it paler, and using that as a color for the bag. So wherever I can, I'm reusing colors. And just grabbing a sort of grayish tan color for the stuff inside, like maybe it's sort of wrapped in a kind of tissue paper, maybe. And so here you can see I've turned the white of the paper off, and now I can see all these gaps where the checker pattern underneath is showing through. So I can more easily see where things like the hanger has to go, because it's, you know, a fairly sort of fiddly color. And then having a look any bits that have got sort of gaps in them. So you can see there's some sort of gaps there where I haven't done the white of the shirt or the color of the hair coming over, because they're quite pale colors, so they'll sort of disappear in white. And there's a bit around the collar there as well. Sorry, not the collar, the cuff on the right hand side. I think I correct that one later, actually. And just visually checking to make sure I haven't missed any bits around the head and face. And yeah, now I'll fill that bit in, and the bit on the inside edge there. And just doing a bit of sort of self-checking. It can be really worth just spending a minute or two between each stage to make sure that you've got that stage completely signed off before you move on to the next one. Instead of having to spend, X amount of time coming back and fixing it. Now here, I've gone to the flats layer, and I've gone to Edit, Corrections, and Line Width. The Line Width correction tool isn't great for line art, I don't think, but it's fantastic for your flats. So here, I'm just making it wider to the point where it sort of fills in any of those little white specks that the bucket fill leaves behind. If you've used the bucket fill a lot, you know it has trouble getting into sort of sharp corners. This is a great way to just sort of bleed the flats out a bit and fill in some of those layers. So with that done, my flats are done. Now my flats are all on one layer. That's really useful for a bunch of stuff. So I do recommend you do all your flats on one layer. Now I'm going to go to my tone variants, and that's the first use for it. So you notice that I've set my flats layer with a lighthouse icon on it there as a reference layer. And now when I use my magic wand tool, I can just select whatever color I want, and it'll ignore whatever layer I'm on and just make a selection based on my flats. So now my magic wand is just grab all the skin, just grab all the hair. It's really, really handy. And so in this one, I grabbed just all the hair, and in a layer on top of the flats, I was able to lay in some pink as an overlay there on the hair to give it that dual tone. And the same thing I can do now, I'll just grab the skin tones. So magic wand, click on the skin, it'll grab all that. And then with a big soft airbrush, I can do the areas of blush around things like the cheeks, the collarbone, the tips of the fingers, anywhere where bone comes close to the surface, I'll add some blush there. And then like maybe on the tip of the ear there. That's looking pretty good. That's the other thing about the big soft airbrush. You shouldn't be using the big soft airbrush for drawing. The big soft airbrush is for effects only. So even things like this, where I'm doing some sort of a blush stroke, some little lines, I'm being very, very sparing, and I'm using that same, again, that hard, round brush that I use for everything. It is a hard-edged, round brush with pressure for opacity. It's what I use for everything except for effects, because that's what the soft airbrush is for. And that's the only thing the soft airbrush is for. Alright, so now I'm making a shading layer. Now I did a control click on the flats, which will make a selection based on whatever's in the flats layer, which is the flats. And so now when I go to a new layer with that selection active and hit the make alpha mask button, that'll make a mask out of that selection. So now my shading can only happen inside where the flats are, or at least where the flats are. And so I don't have to worry about sort of making selections, but I can still use that with the magic wand tool, so I can select just the hair, and I can work inside that. I can also be assured when I want to do it freehand that it won't go outside the lines. And so here, I've grabbed just a neutral kind of purplish pink, like a pale desaturated purplish pink to do the shading with on a multiply layer. The color you use here doesn't matter too much. I use my flats later in the line, or a copy of them, to control what color the shading ends up being. So instead of trying to get the shading color right per section, what I do is I'll get the I'll get the flats and I'll use that to control the shading. I'll have the shading come up as though I shaded with a color shifted, slightly darker version of the yellow here. And then when I get to things like the skin tone and shirt and dark object, it'll cleverly kind of adjust my shading color to have been the right kind of color. So here I'm just sort of marking out where I want the shading to be. I don't have to worry too much about how dark or light the shading is. Since I'm going for a sort of cell-shaded look, I can just drop the tone where I want it to be, and then I'll come in later and correct what sort of lightness and color that is by just manipulating a copy of the flats. That's one of the other reasons why it's so handy to have all your flats on one layer. Now, as far as how to do the shading, I'm trying to be very quick with this. Probably the quickest way would be to do your shading with the lasso tool. That's not something everyone's sort of too up on, so I thought I'd skip that one for now. We can make a later thing of that. But this one, I've just got a fairly medium-sized brush, and I'm brushing it in, and then I'm pressing C on the keyboard to switch. This is in Clip Studio. It'll be a different shortcut in different software. Like I think in Paint Tool Sci, it's negative on the keyboard from memory, and that'll turn whatever brush you're using into an eraser with the same properties, so the same size, same opacity controls, but instead of laying down tone and laying down paint, it lifts it off in the same way. That's really good for something like this, where I want to be doing tone and then taking tone away with something that's the same size. Whereas if I was switching to the eraser, what would happen is I might have a big soft eraser, but I might be trying to do hard edges of shading and take away a hard edge just like I added a hard edge. And so then I would have to move the eraser around and sort of rejig that. Whereas if I just press C on the keyboard and switch this from brush to an eraser with the same properties, I'm dealing with the same sort of size, I'm dealing with the same sort of shape and edge controls. So it's a great way of doing stuff like this, where you can sort of work up and down and just sort of flick between adding and removing the tone there. And it's also a great way to get sort of thin sections. You notice we've got lots of really sort of thin lines there, even though those thin lines of shading are significantly thinner than the actual brush itself. And the brush doesn't get thinner. It's just a great way of just dropping a bit in and then shaving some of the edge of it off to sort of control the thickness of those sections of shading. So brushing in and then brushing out. And then doing a bit more here for where the hair intakes go up towards the top. I don't want to do too much detail here. I just want to have some bits of those. You can see where those sections of hair narrow in. I wanted to have some continuation of those lines moving up, but not have them be line art. Because once I've corrected the shading color here, these bits of tone are actually going to be a fair bit lighter. So I'm keeping that in mind, that these are going to be a bit lighter in the final one, but they'll be lighter based on the lightness of the object they're on, so I don't have to put too much thought into it. But if I feel like they're a bit overpowering now, that's okay. I'll come back and see if that's still the case when it comes time to finalize it. So you can see there, brushing a thick line in, and then brushing it out to control that sort of thickness of tone there. And also trying to be fairly bold with the tone I'm using. So not in the little sections of shading, but rather things like trying to have bigger areas of shading. So things like where the hair goes behind the head, just making sure that the whole thing is shaded out. And then just moving down the picture, doing the same thing. Anywhere where I've got some sort of little bits of what would be ambient occlusion, just following those in. A bit more. Just adding a bit more sort of shading as we go down. And there. And so I'm focusing more on sort of edge of the hair there, and now that I've done that sort of edge where I want that to be, I'm just going to fill in the back hair there. The hair on the back, not the hair on a person's back. I imagine she'd wax. And so I'm just sort of filling that in there with a big area of tone. I probably should have sort of switched my brush up, but I'm kind of rushing at this point. The idea I can get this sort of cowboy shot, fairly detailed figure done in like... I had aimed for an hour, but I feel like getting something like this done in 2 hours is pretty reasonable. But again, if this is too much for you, that's fine. But we're approaching the end. We're getting towards the end. That's looking okay. Yep. Just think if there's any other bits I want to sort of clean up or add some tone to. Now here, I'm just going to grab, you can see here I've got the lasso, and the lasso smoothing up all the way. I just want to do a little gentle bit of darker tone around the top of the head, Mainly so I've got something for the highlight to play off of a little later. And so I'm going to get a very, very soft brush, which is just my hard brown brush. I'm going to be very, very light with it, and I just want to add that little bit there of dark along the top there, as it's more of a sort of reflection of the surrounding area, but it's also a bit of dark for the highlights that I'm going to put in later to play off of. It just sort of gives them a bit more contrast to you. So now, again, since I've got my flats as a reference layer, I do the magic wand selection. That just grabs all of the skin tones at once, and I can just work in the skin tones to add little bits of shadow, things like where the hair is casting shadow on the face to help separate those planes out. And then the crease there for the eyes, which is another important thing. The detail and dark bits you add to the top sections of the eyes really do help get a lot of attention. So make sure they're a thing you don't neglect, because they're a great way to get impact in your illustration, is to add some strong values, so like light and dark, towards the upper parts of the eyes, because that really helps sort of snap attention to them. And so I'm just doing a bit of a shape for a bit of shading above the nose. Now this seems a bit weird because you've got like shading above the nose, but what this is since the nose, like the bridge of the nose goes in, just like the eyelids go in, it's more of a communication of some ambient occlusion shadow just to give the face a bit more depth. So that dark bit of shadow you see on top of the nose is more there to help give the face a bit of depth and describe a direction of light, because otherwise it'd have to be being lit from below, but they're not, and that still looks fine because that light is representative of ambient occlusion. And so here I'm doing a bit of shadow on the eyes, even though the eyes bulge out, and so obviously they're a sphere, they should be, you know, shaded along the bottom edge. That's the cast shadow from the top of the eyelashes, so that just helps give the eyes a bit of depth there. And so just doing a bit of shading on the inside of the mouth. And then grabbing the skin tones there. And then doing another bit of shading there. Remember that most of the shadows here are going to be shadows dropped by the head onto the body. So cast shadows are so much more important than shading the shape of an object. So for instance here, I'm going to have maybe a little bit of lighting coming around and being visible. But primarily, I want to really give this depth by having a hard shadow on the neck. The only time the neck would be lit is if they're lit directly from the front with a low angle light, which is almost never. So unless that's the lighting scenario you're going for, you are going to have shadow directly under the chin on the neck in almost every case. And it's great because it gives a lot of depth straight off the bat. And so here I'm just doing some shading there and trying to sort of keep in mind a bit of drop shadow from the hair onto the body. And then doing the shading on the palm there, again trying to think like what have I got that's dropping a shadow onto something else. So I've got like maybe some shadow being dropped from the fingers onto the palm below them to help give that a bit of depth. And then do I have a bit of shadow from the hand over the wrist maybe? Maybe not, that's probably going to be a bit sort of too hopeful, but and then of course some ambient shadow down there where it goes into the sleeve for the shirt. And then on the other hand, same deal, just seeing where I've got sort of shadow being cast by a thing on itself, or I've got a surface facing down that I can use to give a bit of depth to the hands. I don't want to give too much sort of detail shading to the hands, because that can, you know, too much detail in the hands can make them look kind of maybe sort of spooky or masculine or whatever. One of the things with like detail is it's not very cute. So if you are trying to go for cuteness, then you want to simplify the shadow, so go for more sort of surface planes. But if you do want to make something look sort of rough and hard, then lots and lots of detail can really do that. Think of the demonstration of someone, I forget what it did. They got like an anime character and they gave them hyper realistic teeth, and it really just changed the whole vibe. Alright, moving down, I'll do a big simple drop shadow for the scrunchie. And then sort of ambient shadow for the sleeve. I'm trying to sort of bust it through these, but Right, and with that, I can now move on to some of the shirt. So the shirt, again, underneath the head will have a lot of cast shadow, where the head is casting a shadow on the collar. And so here you can see I'm doing the seam on the collar by using tone. So I'll draw some tone in and then rub some tone out, and leaving just a little thin line of it there will communicate as being a seam, like a stitched area on the outfit. Or I don't want to necessarily include like hard black line art, but I still want to have a communication that there's something there. So that can be a great way of doing it. Just draw some in, cut it out, and leaving that thin little line of tone there can imply that there's a sort of a bit of stitching there, the fabric's being pinched in. And then just doing sort of some strokes coming out from under the arm there. And then what I'm going to do is erase some of them out to make those thin bands of tone that are going to come out from them to show those sort of folds there. So I'll do all of these, the big area of tone first, and then I'll start sort of refining it. So I just want to get those surface planes first. So like with the boobs here, that's a very big sort of forward-facing mass of sort of shape, and so what that means is it's going to have a fairly big shadow under it. So I want to make sure I've got the surface plane of the top of it communicating right based on where I've got the lighting coming from, which is roughly like, you know, above and a bit forward. But it's fairly sort of soft light because I wanted this to be someone who's sort of shopping, but I didn't want to go sort of full shopping fluoro lights because they're just terrible. And then just a bit of the under the arm here, and then more of those sort of creases over the top, and just sort of drawing them in and taking them out to make those sort of lines, those bands there. And then adding in the drop shadow for the collar, casting a shadow on itself, and then the hair, of course, casting a shadow on itself as well. And there, where the shadow of the hair would come over the top of the shoulder, I've got that shaded out. And then here, where I'll have a big sort of fold coming from the shoulder, I'll have some sort of communication of fold and crease on the outfit, but I won't do it with line art. I'm just going to do it with bits of tone. And so I'll draw them in and then cut them out to show that sort of creased up fabric. And then I'll run a little bit of tone along the actual sort of crease, sort of seam there along the shoulder. Right, and then moving on to the cuffs here. So I'll have a big sort of shadow over there as the top part of the cuff sort of leans forward. And again, on the bottom, I've got that line of tone there to communicate the seam in the clothing. Because while that bottom edge is facing upwards, I still want to have a bit of tone on there to communicate that sort of that seam. Now this area underneath here will be pretty much, well, there'll be a lot of shading here because it's got a lot of sort of stuff over the top of it. And it's got a lot of sort of crease going on. And I want to really sort of separate it out from the rest. So I'm going to have a lot of tone here just to really push it back a lot. So I want sort of the arm and the boobs to come forwards, and I want the elbow to go backwards. I want to sort of communicate that depth where I can. And so now I'm doing a whole bunch of shading here, because if they're leaning forwards, then everything on this front edge of the body is going to be shaded out. So even though there's a lot of shape going on here, most of it will just be lost to the drop shadow of them leaning forwards. And while I do lose the opportunity to shape and detail the figure there, I gain so much more from having a big, strong shadow there in how much depth that gives to it. So while I lose the subtle edges of surface and detailing, I gain so much more in overall depth and overall shape. So always take the bold shading decisions when you can. It'll lead you to, having a lot more sort of depth in your piece. And now I'm just doing some little jagged lines in here to communicate those sort of creases as they gather in the center there and from where they're started on the sides. That's looking okay so far. And so you can see I've done that little sort of wedge by doing a big blob of erasure and then a big blob back of tone. And then the bits of shirt that are sitting underneath the jumper, those I'm just going to shade out almost completely. Moving on then to this arm that I keep forgetting about and having to do last. Same thing as before, I've got the creases coming from underneath the arm. So as you move your arm up, you'll notice there's a lot of sort of stretchy creases that come from the underarm. This is because clothes are, with a couple of exceptions, made to be worn with your arms down, which means the folds will be less pronounced when your arms are down, but as soon as you move them up, the creases and folds will show up and they'll be there pulling from those tension points, one of which is underneath the arm. And so now I'm just doing the folds along the top there, and the folds that are going to radiate out from the crease of the elbow in there. And then more in the elbow itself. I do want to sort of try and add more creases into the darker areas. One of the things you'll notice is that in darker areas, the creases will be wider. In lighter areas, the creases will be narrower. And so that's a great way you can control your overall tone without having to do like an overall gradient of shadow. You just do whether or not those bits of tone end up thicker or lighter, depending how well lit that surface should be. And then those overall bits of light or dark in aggregate will give that surface more of a shaded feel or more of a lit feel. So then just some lines down from the side there of the crease. And then that thinner bit along there to communicate that that's a seam. That seam is sort of facing upwards. It's largely okay. I'm just doing a bit of a sort of broad view check on it to see if I need to sort of make any changes. Otherwise it's working okay before I move on to the next one. And you'll see me do this a lot where I'll do sort of check. So here you can see I noticed that I didn't come back and sort of add detail to these bits of line here under the collar on the left side. And so I'm adding a bit more sort of a crease there. And then similar to those lines of seams around the collars, I've done one there on the shoulder because I realized I had line art on the one on the right, but I didn't have line art on the one on the left, and I still wanted to have that separation. And now doing the shading here on the bow. Now you can see the shading doesn't come out very bright, very dark. And that's one of the things that the shading control layer that I spoke of before is going to help with. So it takes the light and dark information from the flats as well. So where the shading needs to be darker, it takes the darkness from the flats. Where the shading needs to be lighter, it takes the lightness from the flats as well. So here I'm just dropping the shadow underneath the bow, and the bow onto itself as well, and the bow onto the shirt, and just sort of going around and having a rough idea of where it needs to go. It doesn't have to be exactly accurate, just having it be roughly there will be right. That's me dropping the wrong color there. And again. And then a bit more, just little bits of dark, sort of ambient shadow around there, and then some little lines coming up along the boob here to show a sort of, essentially like a seam of fabric there. It's mainly that's there to help give contour to that part of the chest, but it also, any sort of seams you add to the clothing will help communicate that it is cloth. You'll see this a lot with things like, if you do like the Playboy Bunny leotard outfit often, which I do, that probably speaks volumes about me, is that the communication of an outfit like that isn't about the shape of it, but rather it's about the seams and how the seams pick up light and shadow. And so adding details like that to the shirt can help communicate some of that contour of the body, and also it really does communicate that this is fabric. Yeah, all look fairly good so far. Moving on then to the jumper. So same as before, just doing those big areas and then making them simple and making them give them a bit of sort of detail once I've done the simple, large forms, and then sort of narrowing it down and adding that detail in. And so adding the shading there for the underside of that big sort of section of crease. And so try to think of those sort of creases as big rounded sections. At the same time, have them covered by big cast shadows. So for instance, as they go around the body, they're not going to catch as much light, and since they're underneath things like the chest and the upper body, they're going to be sort of shaded out. And here I'm doing a few just sort of lines that will imply that sort of patterning they have with the like the collars and cuffs, where they have that, I'm not sure what you call it, like a cardiganing or something. I'm sure there's a word for it. And then with that, I can start moving on to the rest of the knot. So for instance, the underside of those planes there. And then also some little creases for them internally, just because where the knot is, there's going to be a lot of tension. And where there's tension, you'll get these hard little creases. And so the same thing with things like where the knot comes out into the arms of the jumper, or parka, or whatever you call it. I want a lot of line work there to show those hard little creases, but overall, I want that to be very light. So it means I'll have a lot of creases there, comparatively, but the creases will be narrower, because that way it'll communicate that sort of tension of fabric without making that surface look like it's really, really dark and downward facing. And then a bit more for the creases on the left-hand side, which I'm aware will be the right-hand side in the final image, but you know, it is what it is. And then a bit more on the side there, just to show the sort of, they become rounder and more wrapped around as they sort of go further out from the knot, because the knot will sort of flatten them a bit. And then again, big area of tone there. Think of them as sort of big, sort of creased bits of paper. And then a bit more on the side. And just a big sort of, big plane of shadow there. Just to really sort of send it back. If you want to send something away and give something depth, feel free to add just a whole section of shadow if you want. Even if it doesn't make perfect sense, if it really does help with the image, it's definitely worth doing. And so a bit more there, and a bit more on the underside there, just to sort of lift some of the crease down and out there, just to complicate it. It's a bit too regular with the creases there. I noticed that I'd made them roughly the same sort of size sections, one after the other, and that sort of boring sort of sequential sameness of size wasn't helping. So now I'm trying to do the irregular internal sort of shading on the scrunchie. I was going to say sort of hair bun, but it's not a hair bun, it's a scrunchie. And you'll notice that I'm doing thicker and thicker bits of shading as I move down, because since the object is rounded, each of those sort of lips will catch less light as it goes down towards the bottom of the image. And so a similar thing here with this one, but the other way, I'll have a lot more sort of shading on the bottom half of it, and more where it goes around the edges as they sort of move away from that semi-front facing light source. And I'm just trying to do fairly random shapes, honestly, that the random shapes just sort of start and end from those crease bits on the outer edges. Alright, and then it's looking okay so far. Yep. I'm getting towards the last sort of stretch here, which is good to see. Probably about another 10 minutes to go, and we're out the door, or 10, 15. And so I'm adding a bit of tone on the choker there. And I'm trying to be relatively regular with it. And remember, the shine and sort of reflection is not the same as your shading. So you can have a mirror and have an awning over the top of the mirror, but it won't make the mirror's reflection darker. So if something is being toned based on a reflection, the surrounding lighting won't really do much to it. Surrounding light sources might be reflected. You may have a reflection of objects, but the thing itself won't be lighter or darker necessarily based on that. So now I'm going to do the sort of reflective patterning on the top of the bra. Now just filling a bit of the shape on the left side there as well. And again, trying to make it look consistent. One of the big things about making a reflective surface look reflective is that the reflections are consistent. Like I was saying before, if you have like a collection of, you know, mirror finish or chrome like grapes, like a sculpture like that, you would expect in each of those round shapes to see the same reflected yourself shown too, because a reflection or shine is based on the direction the surface is facing. It's not a matter of whether it's lit or not. So whatever the random assortment of shapes you choose for the reflection, so long as it's consistent, that'll be fine. It's showing a reflection or a map of shines based on a thing the viewer can't see. So here, if they're, for instance, if they're like chrome finish, they will be showing us a reflection of what's behind the viewer or of the viewer themselves, which is something isn't included in the picture. So you can add whatever you like. Now I'm just going to get sort of a rounded shape in there and just sort of smooth that out and include some little bits that will disturb those shapes. So where you'd have the points of tension along like the top and bottom corners of the sections of fabric, those points of tension are going to disturb that reflection or that sort of map of shine. Let's be sort of wrestling with the wrong tool there. And so long as I keep them roughly consistent, I'll be okay, because you do expect some sort of disturbance of that pattern of shine and reflection. So long as it's broadly right, I should be okay. And there's some sort of recognizable features, we'll be all right. I'm just adding a little bit of a thin bit along the top there. And you can see again, for all these sort of fine lines, I'm not switching the size of my brush. I've just brushed some in, brushed some out. And that gives me a really good sort of control over the thickness. If you've got, you know, good hand control to control your thickness, then, you know, by all means, go for it. And then just a bit of shading there on the straps. I don't want to go too far, just because even if they were sort of chrome shiny, if an object is so small, it doesn't really sort of make sense to put the entire mapped reflection on there. So using just a sort of simplified bit or just a bit of tone can work just fine as well. And so here I'm just doing a sort of a shaded line in the middle of the hanger just to sort of imply that reflective kind of shiny nature. But it's going to be quite small and quite narrow in the frame, so I don't have to worry too much about it. And now just looking around the image to see what I need to shade next, and that would be the bag and the skirt. So just zooming in there. And so here, just selecting the bag area. So again, using that reference layer selection. And then just shading basically the whole thing out bar the front. The reason for that is, even though not all of it would be perfectly in shadow, I really want to send it back. I really want to sort of separate it from the body so it's not sort of all sitting flat on one plane. Now just doing a bit more, just sort of peeling some of it back and then putting it back in to get that sort of shading right. Better to sort of overdo it and then peel it back than not add enough. Too much shading will maybe darken things too much, but nowhere near enough shading will leave things sort of flat. And even if you end up making things look weird, it's better that it looks weird than flat and boring, so always overdo it if you've got the choice, because like I say, weird is still better than boring. And then just adding a bit more shade on the strap there, where there's sort of no way there'd be an angle for light to get in there. That's looking pretty good so far. And just, again, taking a zoomed out view, see anything I've missed, like for instance this bit of the hair behind the head that I've missed a bit of shading on. And then just tidying up a couple of those edges. Yeah, looking okay. And then gonna have the shine on the nail. So now that I've kind of established what the shine map will be, any shiny object will have the same thing on it, because again, like I said, with the, if you have like a bunch of like metallic spheres, the same thing will be on all of them, because the reflection will be of the same thing. So anything that is reflective will show the same thing. If you stand in front of a bunch of mirrors, they're all going to show the same person. And if they don't, you're in a horror movie. I'm just getting a bit more on the nails. That's all good. Yep, that's looking fairly good. Again, I was kind of rushing this one, so I'm probably spending a little bit more time on error correction than I actually needed to. Now, here what I'm doing is I wanted a sort of gentle grade just to really show the roundness of this part of the body. So I've made a selection, I've used the reference layer to deselect the ribbon, and now with a very, very soft brush, I'm just putting a very gentle grade from above. This is to sort of simulate some ambient occlusion shadows, but just very, very subtly to give it a bit of roundness, because the big, bold white surface, or sort of the white of the shirt surface, was a bit too strong. So I just wanted to sort of soften that a little tiny bit and take away some of that. And just while I'm here, fixing up some little sort of skerricks of shading. And then seeing if I want to have a bit more or a bit less on the side of the face there. And throwing a bit on the eyes as well. That's looking alright. Alright, so zooming out. See what's next on the list. I'm just making a color corrector. So what this is, it's a copy of the flats. And now I'm going to do a hue and saturation adjustment. And I'm going to, as you can see here, lower the hue down by about 15 to 25. And then lower the luminosity down by about, 15 to 20, whatever the image needs. What this does is make a darker, hue-shifted version of the flats. When I now group that to my shading layer, the shading layer acts as if I shaded with those colors instead. And that's really handy because if you shade using multiply with like a color on the opposite end of the color wheel, it'll really deaden the color. And by the same token, it takes the darkness from whatever you're shading with, which means a pale color won't be able to shade dark objects, and a dark color will shade too much on light objects. This way, the lightness and color information are taken from the flats, which means they're always done relative to what the flats need. But I talk about this one in the post-processing video, so I'll send a little link to that as well. And I should make a YouTube short for it, since I mention it so much and sort of link a lot of people to it, since it seems to be a very useful sort of thing I've dug up, along with, a myriad of manhwa artists who've definitely discovered the same thing. So I like to think I invented it in the same way probably about, a million cavemen thought that they invented hitting things with rocks. Like, yes, you came up with it, but it was always going to be found pretty soon. So, just getting a bit of an extra. So this is another layer of shading. So same thing, I just duplicated the existing shading layer and also duplicated a color controller layer on top, and then deleted all the shading that was on there and just adding a bit more shading in. What this means is I can just have a bit of extra shadow in areas that are already shaded. And so if an area is already shaded, what that will mean is that it may need to have some ambient occlusion shading, because if it's missed out on the primary light source, that's fine. But depending on its shape, it may also be missing out on some ambient light. So you'll see, like, you can still make out light and dark inside shadows. The reason for that is there's always going to still be ambient light. So this bit of shading here is just adding a little bit of dark spots here and there to simulate, or at least, emulate ambient occlusion, which is the ever-present sort of soft light. So this is, like you can see here, with the shadow from the breasts over the top of the torso, it's a huge area of shadow. And what I want is, in that area of shadow, I still want to be able to see some sort of creases and texture to the shirt. So this lets me have that extra bit of shadow inside already shaded areas. Now, you don't want to use it too much, though, is the only thing. Like, this is something to just use in a few spots very sparingly, because if you use it too much, it will flatten the image. It's sort of similar to using shines and gloss. If you have like shine and gloss everywhere, it goes from being a highlight to just sort of being the tonal range, and then you've made spots of pure white a dull part of the tonal range, which is a terrible thing to do, given spots of pure white can be a really great way to have one or two really bright spots of attention. And so I'm just throwing a few bits around here where it would be darkest. And where I want sort of very nearly a bit of line art. And now I'm doing some on the creases of the skirt. Realizing I haven't actually done any shading on the skirt. Again, a little bit rushed, but we get there, we get there. So just like how the layer where we added thickness to the line art, it can be a good way of going over everything and doing a check to make sure we haven't missed anything. This can also fulfill a similar role with tone. In this case, it's reminded me to check things like the skirt, which I hadn't done the tone for. And so I'm just doing a few big, basic sort of shaded areas. This is already quite a dark area of the character anyway. So if I were to go over this one again with another shading layer, where some parts like the jumper have two levels of shading, this one's so dark that if I were to do that, it would probably be overpowering. So this is probably a good area of the body. If I'm going to forget any of them, this is probably the better one to do it on, because this one wouldn't take 2 levels of shading on it anyway to go to pure black. And so I'm just sort of trying to bang out some simplified shapes for where I think those sort of creases would go. So just throwing them down there. So I want the leg on the right to look like it's coming forward a little bit. So I'm going to do it much lighter than the one on the left to sort of give the impression that it's coming a bit forward. And then since I've reused the color, I've noticed that there's a selection on the choker, so I'll just sort of give that one a bit more tonal range there. That's looking pretty good. So now I'm just doing a bit of an adjustment on the color controller layer on the shirt. The shirt was looking a little bit sort of dull and grey, and so I want to put a bit of blue into that. So I'm just doing a quick hue adjustment on both the color controller layers to give the shirt a bit of blue. Thinking about it, I probably could have done this with the initial creation of the layer, but it's fairly simple to do it twice. But if you are going to sort of do it, it's best to sort of plan ahead. So I've made a selection, and since the selection is controlled by the flats layer, that'll only grab the shirt, and then using that selected area, I've gone to each of the color controller ones and given the shirt a blue tint, which has then meant it's controlled the shading to have the shading look like it's got a bit of a blue tint to it as well. And that works quite well. And also making it a bit sort of paler, I wanted it to be a fairly white, sort of clean, bright shirt. And so I can also lighten the color control layer. The color control layer is great, and it will do 90% of the work for you, which is wonderful, but it won't do 100. So there is still going to be times when you're going to have to go in and do some manual adjustment, but again, if you're working to a deadline, anything that can save you a decent chunk of time can be useful. And so now I'm just doing a bit of shading here. I realized I was trying to shade on the color control layer instead of the actual shading layer, because I'm silly. There we go. Fixing that up there. Realizing I'd been drawing on the color control layer, which meant the color was coming out the wrong color, but that's alright. And now just doing a little bit of extra spots of shading, just the darkest areas, like under the arms. Again, this is talking about the ambient occlusion shading. So anywhere that the ambient light would have trouble reaching. So that would be things like creases, anywhere objects come close to each other, anywhere that is sort of compressed in, like the, under the boobs, under the arms, under the chin, anywhere that light would have trouble coming in from multiple angles, because your ambient light will be brighter on a surface depending how many angles it can be viewed from, essentially. So the inside of the crease in your finger will be quite dark because there's almost no angles that can get all the way in, whereas the top of your head will have plenty of ambient light because it can be seen from basically every angle. Okay, so now I'm making a new layer on top of everything, and this is going to be the highlights. So this one, I'm just going to be doing normal layer and grab some bright white. Now, if I'm doing some more sort of effect highlights, I might pick a different color and a different blend mode, but I'm going for fairly simplistic highlights here. And I'm just going to throw a bit of broken up white highlight across the front of the fringe there. So if the head was a sphere, like a completely smooth sphere, the highlight here would just be like a blob of white, much like it is on the reflective bikini fabric. But since this is broken up by sections, each of those sections of hair will have a piece of the shine on them. And by the same token, there'll probably be a bit of it at the top there, where the surface is sort of concave, but it ends up facing the same direction. And so I'm just putting some of that in there and breaking it up and trying to be really organic with the spacing of those broken up sections of shine. If they're too sort of similar to each other, they have the same piece repeated, it'll look really mechanical and it won't really look like hair. So just making sure that I've got some more organic shaped language there. And so now I'm throwing down some some white on the eyes to give them a bit of shine, a little tiny bit on the lip. But I'm realizing I want to have it sort of broken up there to sort of simulate the banding you get on the shine on actual lips. It's looking okay. And then a little bit there on the cleavage. And so similar to the shine I've got on the hair, I'm going to put some shine on the bikini as well to show it's sort of got a bright sort of banding. And also there's the shine on the choker. Now since this is not in a very, very bright area, I wouldn't expect the white to be too bright just because it could be a bit overpowering. So I'm going to get the shapes right and then I'm going to dull it down a little bit just so I don't have too much bright white showing up in an area of shadow. You can absolutely have that, but for the flow of the image, I want the underside of the neck to be dark. So I'm just going to get rid of those. Or sort of dull them down a bit, rather. And now throwing a bit of shine on the fabric on the bikini. And again, trying to be consistent with where I place it. Because since they're both the same shapes, facing the same directions, you would expect the shine around them to be facing roughly the same way as well. So big blob, little blob, and a line on the top right and the bottom edge. And so long as they're roughly consistent, it'll look like it's a shiny object. And so the same thing then on the downward facing one, but different orientation because the fabric is, a different sort of shape. And just sort of inspecting around the image, see if there's any other shiny objects I need to make sure I bring some attention to. And so I might add a little bit to the edges of the ribbon here, just very softly, and then I'm going to come in and erase it on the edges there, because I want it to be a very sharp, crisp-edged bit of shine, like a sort of satin shine, so it won't go all the way white, and it also won't be very wide. But I do still want a bit of a shine to pick up there, just to sort of make that look a bit more a little bit less matte finish to sort of lift it off the shirt. Alright, that's looking alright. And just doing a bit on the nails there, that's all done. Right, zooming out. Alright, that's looking pretty good. So the figure is largely finished at this point. There's a couple of bits of sort of tuning in to do, but I'm just double checking over the whole thing. Now, what I might do is I'll make a quick background. So one thing that can help with organizing that is to put your figure in a folder, like that. And then lower the opacity of the folder so that you can sort of see through them and just lower everything all at once. The reason why this is good for when you do backgrounds is you don't want to go over and and do detail on a background where the figure's going to be. So for this, I'm just going to do a sort of very, very, very simple implied shop, like a clothing shop. It's going to be very, very simple shapes because I don't want detail and color contrast to pull attention away from the figure. So I'm going to do very, very muted colors, very, very pale colors, and what little sort of information I have will be directing the viewer towards the character. So you can see those two lines at the top of the racks of clothes there are also pointing in towards the character's face. So this will help create a natural sort of flow into the point of focus on the image. And so I'm just picking some very low saturation, pale, neutral sort of colors for just clothing to have there to show that this is a shop where they sell clothes. Don't know how she managed to find a bright pink bikini in what looks like the Vinnie's, local Vinnie's, but you know, maybe Vinnie's carry that kind of things. Who knows? I haven't been there for a while. And just adding a bit more in. Just big, simple shapes. I'm not very concerned because I'm going to have these be very, very defocused. I might even dump a big old blur on it just to make sure it doesn't sort of show up. And if I want like a hard edge to any of these, I'll just draw some in and draw some out. And then just other simple, nice, neutral shapes and very sort of desaturated pale colors. And then just going over and adding implications of the clothes hangers. Again, this will be defocused and deprioritized. So this is essentially a big blobby colored sketch where I'm just putting out these colors and regions for them to be roughly readable as being the inside of a clothing shop, just to contextualize it. But you can see I'm not really spending very much time on this background at all. And so now I've got that. I'm just going to play with luminosity a bit and play with saturation just to get a background that is both sort of roughly colorful, but also very, very muted. And so there you can see just how pale I've made that. And now I'm going to link a layer to that and do just some very, very simple, very, very broad areas of shading on it. I won't be doing any kind of detail shading, but this is just to give it a sense that these objects have some depth. But again, it's not going to be very detailed. I just want very, very simple areas of light and shadow on these to imply that they are clothing. So I'm just doing very, very simple shapes, and then I'm going to blur the heckle out of them all. So it doesn't really matter what's there. It just matters that there's some of them, and that those areas of tone are visually distinct from the objects that they're on. So doing it on the right side now as well. And you can see for the shading, I'm going a fairly sort of light mid-tone purple color. And even then, that's still a bit strong as is, but it doesn't really matter because I'm going to do the same thing with the color control layer that I did on the flats on the main image, and I'm going to do that to this as well. And so now the shading, you can see, has come out relative to the color of the object it's over. So that color control layer is just a matter of duplicating whatever it is you want the shading to be over and using that duplicate to control then the color. And so now behind that, I'm going to have a layer of color, not that bright exactly, but I just want to sort of color in there so I can then tune it down to whatever color I want to sort of fit the backing there. And I'm just going to tune in I'm just put the saturation up. Oh, sorry, there's the opacity up of the figure themselves. And I'm just going to do a bit more of adjustment of that big, broad background color, just so that it's not sort of fighting with or just merging with the figure. That's looking roughly okay. Again, it doesn't have to be very detailed or correct, it just has to be there. And so now you can see I've put all of it into a layer, and I'm going to duplicate that layer, and then I'll flatten that duplicated layer. So now the background is just one single flat image, and so I can blur that single flat image, and that'll give me a sort of a simulated depth of field, which is where, you know, things outside of the focal depth, either too far forward or too far back, will be blurry. That gives a sort of sense of realism, but also the main thing I'm getting out of it is that it visually deprioritizes it. You'll naturally be drawn to things that have really sharp detail. So in this case, the figure is the thing with sharp detail, and the background doesn't have that. The figure is the thing with the contrast, whereas the background doesn't have it. Now here, I'm just trying to do a bit of a softening of the line art. So what I've done with that is I've put one of the color controller layers over the top and duplicated it and put it over the top of the ink and then put it to pin light and then lower the opacity. It can, you can see there, just sort of soften the colors a bit and soften the edges of from having sort of strong black line art. Now, with the image basically finished, I'm just duplicating the entire thing to a new layer, and I'm going to do a blur of one of the duplicates. I'll sort of wait till that kicks in. There we go. And I'm going to use this to do an extra bit of contrast. The reason I'm doing this instead of just doing a hue, like a contrast adjustment, is that if I do a blurred copy of it, change the levels to essentially sort of deep fry it, where the dark parts are really dark and the light parts are almost white, what this can do is give me a way of adding contrast in a more regional way instead of a pixel by pixel way. So I want, for instance, kind of contrast to be based on not just the individual pixel, but the area as a whole. So now I put it to overlay and lower the opacity, and you can see there it gives it a bit of like contrast, a bit more sort of vibrance, and it's more sort of localized. And so I've got that as overlay and then much lower. Next one is I'm going to make a color hierarchy layer. So this one is on top, where I'll grab a full saturation kind of orangey yellow, and I'll also grab a sort of blue color. And I'll put this on initially a normal blend mode layer on about 50%. And I'll just put a bit of bright and dark and sort of warm and cold, and sort of decide on which regions I want to be warm and bright and which regions I want to be dark and cold. So you can sort of think of this as a secondary sort of shading layer almost. And then once I've got the regions mapped out where I like them, I'm going to switch this one also to overlay and lower the opacity down quite a lot. This one, the opacity goes down a lot, because if this one's too strong, it can really sort of mess with whether the image works or not. So you don't want these effects to be very strong. I'll have them, opacity between 15 to maybe 30, but I'll never have them be terribly bright, so I'll lower them down quite a lot. That's looking okay. Now this one's a bit of a vignette I want to add just to pull a bit more focus. So I've set that one to a color burn layer and lowered it all the way down. And I'm wondering if maybe linear burn might work a little better, or maybe multiply. And just essentially not necessarily darken, but lower the intensity of the edges there to sort of pull the viewer more into the center. That's looking pretty good so far. Right, and with that, I'm largely finished. So we've gone from sketch to finished illustration. We've gone through all the steps, inked, flats. We've gone over how to do some post-processing as well. And we've talked through the design aspect, and also talked a little bit about shine as well and how to do that. Now, if you have been drawing along, that is fantastic. I would love to see your work. If you want to post that in the Discord, which is linked in the description. And if you want to show any other work off there, of course, we've got a great community going. And if you like this video and want to see more like it, of course I have a playlist of other 1-to-1 speed draw-alongs, including this same character drawn as a chibi, and a bunch of other videos on tutorials and how to do other things. So by all means, have a nose through, like, subscribe, let the channel know that you care, let YouTube know that this is something you like. And if you're in a position to help the channel grow and want to have these videos happen more often or more regularly, consider becoming a member on our Patreon. If you're interested in updates about the classes and the availability, because a couple of spots are going to be opening up in the next few weeks, then join the Discord and check for notifications there. I'll see you next time. Cheers.